Here's Nigel talking about a compact Class D power amplifier.
The lack of smearing in the mid-range means that you can hear the main performers in the mix nicely separated out, as are cymbal hits and other high-frequency details. The soundstage is pretty much between the speakers, daring to venture out with the most spatial recordings, but I'm not complaining, especially when there's a reasonable placement of performers within the mix. But the timing accuracy to deliver more elusive qualities, such as soundstage depth and lockdown imaging, understandably remain beyond this amp.
Obviously, Nigel is fully entitled to his opinions, but I'd like to pick apart some of his comments and see what they really mean. Firstly,
the lack of smearing in the mid-range means that you can hear the main performers in the mix nicely separated out, as are cymbal hits and other high-frequency details.
Smearing in the mid-range. OK, smearing is bad. There are plenty of ways you could create what could be called smearing in recording and production. But we're considering reproduction here. How can an amp, presumably a bad amp, smear the sound? Suppose you had a time machine and you snuck into Van Gogh's studio while he was taking a break from working on his Starry Night. You run your fingers through the wet paint and smear all the colours. OK, analogies have their limitations, but we can understand the use of the word smear in this context. What about smearing in audio? Well, we have group delay, which is a consequence of phase response, which is a consequence of frequency response. Actually, they're all malevolent friends wandering hand in hand through our enjoyment of audio. Group delay describes how different frequency components of a signal are delayed as they pass through a system. So, suppose we have a transient, maybe an orchestral transient that goes all the way from the Verdi bass drum to polished brass cymbals crashing together. If group delay varies over the frequency range, then different frequencies will be delayed differently. So we can talk about the smearing of transients in this sense. It's a real thing. But I'd have to say that in a modern-day power amplifier, it shouldn't happen, particularly in the mid-range that Nigel mentioned, as that is in the very centre of an amp's performance envelope. Although, arguably, if you were to hear smearing, that's probably where you'd hear it. As for any other causes of smearing, and indeed, what does it actually sound like if you can hear it, well, there's a lovely comments section just down there. Pause now and get to work. Oh, and in other areas of audio, then group delay may bite you, but I'll save that for another video. OK, next.
The soundstage is pretty much between the speakers, daring to venture out with the most spatial recordings, but I'm not complaining, especially when there's a reasonable placement of performers within the mix.
This is interesting. If your system and listening environment are reasonably up to par, then with a decent recording, you should be able to sit between the speakers and hear sound coming, not just from the left and right, but the whole soundstage in between. This is how stereo works. OK, some recordings don't work very well for this, so it isn't always the playback system that's at fault. However, soundstage is a real thing. So, Nigel is talking about a power amp, 2 channels. What could possibly go wrong? Well, there could be crosstalk between the channels, which would narrow the soundstage, more and less at different frequencies even. That would clearly be a defect. There will be some crosstalk. However, we are in a technologically fairly advanced civilization, even though some way from achieving Type 1. Crosstalk in purely electronic equipment should be so low that no one can possibly hear it, or even perceive it through any kind of mystical means. My perspective harks back to the days of analogue tape, particularly multitrack, where crosstalk was, pardon my English, a bloody damn nuisance that had to be carefully managed. The thing is, though, you could test crosstalk for yourself. Just connect one input. Ideally, you'd make up a connector with a resistor of a value that matches the output impedance of your source. But that will take a quick trip to the Amazon and 5 minutes with a soldering iron. Play your music, Backstreet Boys or Wagner as you prefer. Put your ear close to the speaker that's supposed to be inactive. If you hear anything from it, perhaps with a finger in your other ear, then that's crosstalk. I'll bet you don't, though, and if you did, then in normal listening conditions it will be too quiet to notice. Again, commenters, please pause and comment. Now, what about the soundstage daring to venture out with the most spatial recordings? I take this to mean that the soundstage extends beyond the width of the speakers. Well, this is possible. In production, you can bleed a little bit of left channel out of phase into the right and a little bit of right out of phase into the left. And in a multi-mic recording, this can happen by accident, normally at low levels. So there can indeed be spatial recordings. But can an amp either diminish this or exaggerate it? Again, this would be down to crosstalk. I wouldn't deny the possibility of out-of-phase crosstalk, but come on, surely this is hardly likely. Commenters? OK.
But the time inaccuracy to deliver more elusive qualities, such as soundstage depth and lockdown imaging, understandably remain beyond this amp.
Timing accuracy. This could happen. Phase response and group delay relate to frequency response. If the frequency response in the audio band isn't flat, then timing accuracy will be compromised. Negative feedback can cause trouble too, if not properly implemented. Amateur electronics enthusiasts will have, almost certainly at some point in their life, thought they'd built an amplifier, and it turns out they built an oscillator. But clearly, according to Nigel, this amp hasn't quite caught up with the 21st century, and its timing inaccuracy isn't up to delivering soundstage depth and properly locked down imaging. I'll leave the last word to Nigel.
I'm not expecting to hear those little micro details and subtle timbral inflections in the music. I just want the fundamentals of sound quality to be in place.
See you soon. Don't forget to comment.
I can hear all of these things. If you can't, ask your wife. She probably can.